By now you've probably heard about Project 2025. With the election coming up, there's been a lot of hysteria surrounding the plan that some have called Trump's blueprint for establishing a dictatorship, abolishing constitutional rights, or even establishing a theocracy. Obviously there's going to be some sensationalism and hyperbole, but still, could Project 2025 really be that bad? With election cycles being the turbulent torrents of accusations and partisanship that they are, I thought it worthwhile to actually do some deeper digging on the project to see what it was really all about. What I found was genuinely shocking, and I think you're all going to want to stick around for the truth behind Project 2025. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week where we talk about history and politics, so be sure to subscribe, leave us a comment about what you'd like to see next, and stay tuned for more. If you'd like to join the community, we do have a public Discord server linked in the description, along with a community-made subreddit loaded with memes, charts, maps, and more. And of course, if you'd like to help support the channel directly, consider becoming a channel member or donating to us on Patreon. Having dealt with censorship and demonetization in the past, especially when covering more sensitive topics, your support really goes a long way to keeping the channel going. All members do gain access to a separate members-only Discord server where you can speak with me directly. Now, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. Now, of course, I wanted to see what it was everybody was talking about with this, what it was everybody was concentrating on that was so crazy. The central star of the Project 2025 discussion repeatedly appeared to be the Heritage Foundation's lengthy 1,000-page mandate for leadership. It's an extensive guide, or more of a textbook, developed by experts gathered by the Foundation for the purpose of laying out plans, studies, and justifications for various conservative policies for the next Republican administration. In short, it's meant to be a huge list of policy recommendations for the next Republican who takes office. Skimming through the book, it's understandable why left-wingers would be alarmed by some of the policy suggestions laid out here, from placing greater restrictions on abortion, cracking down on DEI and gender programs, and rolling back regulation on business practices. It's definitely a pretty hardcore Republican agenda. But here's the kicker. The mandate for leadership isn't actually central to Project 2025 at all. Heck, it's more of a red herring than anything else. The mandate for leadership is nothing new for the Heritage Foundation. They've actually made these regularly since the Reagan administration in 1981, and Trump even had an edition of this back in 2016. Sometimes presidents implement the suggested policies, sometimes they don't. Most only use about half of what's actually in these if they use it at all. The claim that this book represents everything Trump officially wants to do, however, is false. Now, officially, there's no connection whatsoever between the Trump campaign and the Heritage Foundation who put the book together, but of course, Trump knows people who work at the Heritage Foundation. Many people in politics do tend to know each other, especially when they belong to the same party or faction. And of course, the Heritage Foundation has communicated with Republican campaigns in the past, Trump's included. But the fact is that the mandate for leadership is not Trump's agenda. These are a bunch of suggestions Heritage is making, and Trump, while he has spoken positively about Heritage in the past, and probably has some overlap with these positions, he could genuinely do nothing from the mandate if he really chooses to. It's not a list of his campaign promises, and there's actually reason to believe that he might disregard this altogether. He's been open about a lot of his policy, and some of it even conflicts with the policy suggestions in the book, like this part about raising defense spending and maintaining a strong military stance against Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, when Trump himself has repeatedly emphasized his desire to end foreign interventionism. The mandate for leadership is nothing new, it's a lot less impactful than we think, and it's not even the point of Project 2025. From what I heard, actually reaching out to the Heritage Foundation to answer some questions, it was kind of just tacked on at the last minute since they already give one of these to the Republican presidents anyway. Okay, so if the mandate doesn't matter, what the heck is the point of Project 2025? It's actually something that just about everyone seems to be overlooking or not giving much attention to, and that is the training and talent roster, or the right-wing LinkedIn as some people have called it. Project 2025 is first and foremost about gutting the administrative state and providing the next Republican administration with a catalog of skilled, loyalist appointees. That is the central goal and purpose of the project. But why? A major concern that the Heritage Foundation and many American conservatives have for that matter is that even if Trump were to win re-election, what's going to stop the so-called deep state, specifically in this case, the hundreds of unelected bureaucrats operating several agencies which directly influence and shape national policy with little to no scrutiny, what's stopping them from just sabotaging the next potential Republican administration? During Trump's first term, he faced massive resistance from the administrative state, including from his own appointees, leading to presidential policies that were never put into action, political decisions which were never authorized by the president, and a whole lot of deadlock. Now Trump himself has personally accepted some responsibility for this, acknowledging that he entered office without clarity on who was actually on his side and who actually shared his policy vision. But more than anything, he recognized that he faced significant challenges using executive power from within the executive branch. Okay, but why gut the administrative state? Isn't this just Trump trying to seize more power for himself? Isn't it good that parts of the executive branch are able to rein in the power of the president? The reality has been incredibly obfuscated by the fact that most people aren't familiar with the history of executive power in the United States, the role of the administrative state or civil service, nor what the state of civil service has become in the modern day. Let's start by talking about executive power. Throughout US history, executive power varied widely. You had strong executives who maximized what the president could do, say Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, but you also had more restrained executives who preferred to adopt a more passive role and defer to Congress, the state governments, the free market, etc. Men such as Thomas Jefferson, Warren Harding, and Ronald Reagan. The real peak of executive power was probably FDR's administration. Some might argue Lincoln, given his wartime powers, but FDR also assumed similar powers once America entered World War II, and even prior to this was given carte blanche by Congress to tackle the Great Depression as though it was a war to be won. Some even proposed granting him temporary dictatorial powers, specifically to legislate without the need of Congress until the Depression was solved, with his decisions only vetoable by a supermajority vote from Congress. Of course, those dictatorial powers were never granted, but FDR did expand the abilities of the executive branch to greater heights than ever before, so much so that he needed to delegate some of those additional powers to other members of the branch, but we'll get to that momentarily. After FDR passed, his followers in the New Deal coalition attempted to continue FDR's policies with a similar degree of executive power, but with the Depression solved and the Second Great War won, the need for a powerful executive was waning, and the US presidents wielded it with less success. President Johnson was probably the last major gasp of this New Deal-style executive before Nixon took office and both intentionally and unintentionally diminished executive power. Not only did Nixon seek to cut back the role of the federal government in general in the lives of Americans, but his handling of the Watergate scandal fractured the prestige of the executive and saw many cry out for greater oversight and limitation on executive power as a result. Carter's shortcomings would further diminish executive prestige with his crisis of confidence. Reagan would aim to further decentralize power and shrink the role of the federal government, and ever since then, US presidents have generally followed suit, operating with less and less direct power than their predecessors, with Donald Trump and Joe Biden arguably being the first president since Reagan to break this trend. A more powerful executive, especially one in line with the powers demonstrated by the past Trump and Biden administrations, is nothing out of the ordinary in US history. Rather, we have simply been in a long period of relatively weak executive power, and whether it be on the left or the right, we are seeing a significant reorientation toward a more activist executive in the mold of past presidents like FDR, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and McKinley. Now, while we have lived in an age of a relatively weak executive, this is not to mean we live in an age of relatively small government. Somehow the government of today can feel overbearingly involved, yet totally useless at providing the basic services many want and expect, especially when we consider that most middle-class and lower-class Americans are facing taxation not far off from what they had during FDR's terms, yet enjoy very few of the same benefits provided during that time. Well, this is where we get into the issue of the administrative state, the bureaucrats who in many cases are responsible for ensuring that the public services provided by the government do what they're supposed to do, are run well and run efficiently, but very obviously are not. The administrative state refers to a collection of unelected government officials or bureaucrats who manage daily governance and often wield significant influence. This sector has become a substantial force in the US government. During the New Deal era under FDR and in response to the Great Depression, the federal government expanded dramatically. New agencies like the Social Security Administration, the Securities and Exchange Commission were created to address economic and social crises. With this growth, the administrative state became essential to implementing national policies and regulations. These agencies were run by skilled officials who were loyal to FDR's New Deal agenda, and for a time this model worked relatively well. Bureaucracies were seen as key tools in governing the complex machinery of the country. However, over the decades, as the administrative state continued to grow, so too did concerns over its efficiency and accountability. After World War II, and especially in the 1970s, faith in the system started to erode. Scandals such as Watergate severely damaged public trust in government, leading to calls for reforms in how the executive branch and its agencies operated. Congress began increasingly exerting control over federal agencies, often resulting in a more fragmented system where executive control became diluted. This shift is important because it exemplifies how the balance of power moved toward Congress and undermined the president's influence over the bureaucracy. This growing tension between Congress and the executive made the bureaucracy less responsive to direct presidential oversight, creating more inefficiencies over time. A significant blow to the quality of the administrative state came with the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 under Jimmy Carter. The intention was to modernize federal employment practices and improve the efficiency of the government workforce. However, in practice, the reforms made it difficult to hold civil servants accountable. The act abolished the Civil Service Commission in favor of new agencies like the Office of Personnel Management and the Merit Systems Protection Board, which in turn weakened the rigorous merit-based standards established under the Pendleton Act way back in 1883, which set the standard for a professional and meritocratic civil service and created the unique conditions where over 90% of federal employees were held to merit-based standards, which allowed FDR to have the administrative state he did. But in one fell swoop, Carter had eradicated that. As a result, firing or disciplining underperforming employees became more difficult, leading to the stagnation of the civil service we see today. With 15 executive federal agencies and hundreds of sub-agencies below them run by unelected officials shaping how commerce, justice, energy, housing, education, defense, health, transportation, agriculture, and more are managed, and with little to no quality control or ability to hold these officials accountable, this is something that Americans should be concerned about. Even more so given the fact that despite being nested under the executive branch, the executive has little control over these departments and their sub-departments, whose officials would be protected from removal to prevent a spoil system, yet are no longer held to the merit-based criteria of the past, creating an entrenched bureaucracy which is extremely difficult to reform and very difficult to hold to high standards. Once again, thousands of unelected officials that you've probably never heard of are making some of the most vital decisions shaping how life in America works, and there's very little ensuring that they're actually doing a good job at it. Further, these departments receive some $4 trillion in funding annually. Where is it all going? Should we really trust this system as it runs right now with all that money? Now, over time, the bureaucracy has additionally grown more disconnected from the electorate. Civil servants will regularly outlast presidential administrations, creating a layer of governance that remains entrenched regardless of which party holds power. This consistency and independence, while beneficial for long-term projects, also results in the administrative state being insulated, sluggish, and unresponsive to change, including those necessary reforms aimed at making it more efficient and meritocratic. If a president is doing a lousy job, you can blame him and you can vote him out of office. If a congressman is doing a lousy job, you can blame him and vote him out of office. You can't vote members of the administrative state out of office. But that might finally change. Once again, Project 2025, or more specifically the mandate for leadership, has a lot of very, very partisan stuff that's just not going to fly with the other side. It reads like a strictly Republican agenda. But the biggest highlight, something I think that most Americans can get behind, is the idea of reforming the administrative state, and both Trump and Project 2025 have independently made different proposals for how to tackle the issue of the administrative state. Everything from reclassifying these jobs into ones which could be more easily replaceable, to placing them under the jurisdiction of an efficiency commission, to shrinking the size of the executive branch while giving the president more direct control over the functions of these executive departments. In essence, consolidating the powers of the cabinet into the executive himself. None of these measures are particularly radical or extreme when we consider how much of a roadblock the administrative state has been to policy making. And despite what some people have claimed, this doesn't include anything that would hinder Congress's influence over the presidency. Some of the oversight that Congress would have over those departments is going to be rescinded just because those departments wouldn't exist anymore or would be consolidated under the executive himself, but there's still going to be checks and balances between the branches of government. The only thing that's talked about is a consolidation within the executive branch. This isn't the executive consolidating powers that are typically given to Congress or to the Supreme Court. This is the executive gaining more control over the executive branch. Whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, you must be able to acknowledge that we vote for our candidates because we want them to fulfill their promises. We want them to make America better in whatever form that might be. But what happens when they get into office, try to push that change, only for it to be held back by an unseen and manipulative body of unelected officials? We elect representatives to represent us. That's what we signed up for, not a bureaucratic oligarchy. So when people do point to this aspect of Project 2025 as a scheme to give Trump dictatorial powers, I don't buy it. Whether it was the Heritage Foundation or the Center for American Progress saying that we need to reform the administrative state, it's true. It's an institution that needs reform. Now, speaking of the Center for American Progress, they were among the loudest and earliest challengers of Project 2025, which is ironic considering that they were founded as a direct rival to the Heritage Foundation, and as you might expect from a rival, they also create blueprints and transition projects for Democratic administrations every election. And they essentially had their own liberal versions of Project 2025 for Biden in 2020 and Obama in 2008. It's even been said of the organization, quote, "Not since the Heritage Foundation helped guide Ronald Reagan's transition in 1981 has a single outside group held so much sway," and that it is, quote, "the most influential think tank of the Biden era." Now, Heritage, as I said, puts together the so-called blueprints for Republican administrations every election and tries to work with the administrations if they win, but Project 2025 is the first time Heritage has actually undertaken an effort to have pre-trained staffers ready for the president on such a large scale. Again, the mandate for leadership is kind of superfluous. If it wasn't, alarm for it would have been raised during past Republican administrations who also got similar books. Is the mandate a bit extreme? Sure, but once again, they're really just suggestions that most presidents barely adopt half of, if any. What most of these Democrat-aligned organizations are probably most concerned about is the actual training and transition project as well as the plan to reform the administrative state, because it would make the next Republican administration actually effective at carrying out its agenda, which again is defined by Trump, not by the Heritage Foundation and its mandate for leadership. I mean, they don't even try to hide that they do this themselves. To quote the CAP's sister organization CAP Action, quote, "Long before the election, this team worked closely together almost as a shadow government to exercise cooperation, work on specific problems, and develop initiatives that would be implemented soon upon President Obama's inauguration. This model was highly successful in ensuring critical members of the president's staff were prepared to work together in the best interest of the country and the president once they began serving in the White House." Now, I think you have an instance here of Democratic factions recognizing Republican attempts to implement similar successful strategies they themselves have used, and are fearful that this will amount to actual major change in Republican favor. It's not really a transition project, but they even have a project called Progress 2050, which literally sounds like something that was invented to one-up Project 2025. Let's summarize all of this. 1. The Heritage Foundation has been involved in working with past Republican administrations, and we might expect it to have some influence in a second Trump administration, though Trump has attempted to distance himself from the organization. 2. The Heritage Foundation's mandate for leadership, though it does contain some pretty radical Republican policy, is actually nothing new since they've literally published these every few years to advise Republican presidents on policy actions, and somehow the book has never raised alarm in the past, even when one was published for Trump's 2016 presidency. 3. Trump has no obligation to abide by anything in the mandate for leadership, which at times does explicitly conflict with his own stated agenda. Trump is also much less willing to take advice from outside groups this time around, having felt as though he was misled during his first term. 4. The core of Project 2025 is actually the transition project aimed at recruiting and training staffers in the event of a Republican victory and working to gut the administrative state. 5. Criticism of the administrative state by the Heritage Foundation, in all fairness, does hold weight, and this is something which does need reform. 6. While a consequence of gutting the administrative state would be a more effective executive, this does not reach anything on the scale of an American dictatorship, likely bringing executive power back to what it had been around the late 1800s and early 1900s, but not nearing the peak it had reached under FDR. 7. Organizations and groups aligned with the Democratic Party have incentive to demonize Project 2025 as something much worse than it actually is, when in reality it is nearly identical to much of what those organizations do for the Democratic Party already, from drafting up policy blueprints, overseeing transitions, and recruiting staffers to ensure a more effective administration. Altogether, I don't think Project 2025 is the terrifying and authoritarian plan many people have made it out to be, and while I doubt Trump is going to do anything with the mandate for leadership if he wins, I do think it's good that one of the overlaps between his agenda and the agenda Heritage put forward, reforming the administrative state in one way or another, has remained a key part of his platform, as government inefficiency has been a massive issue plaguing the US for years, and being able to have a government actually representative of the country and interested in pushing the policy that people vote for should be fundamental to how our system works. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.